9:15, it's the morning show with Jeff and Will on AM 1700 WRCR, Haverstraw, WRCR.com. Welcome back, everybody. Joining us now, Tina Traster, the editor of the Rockland County Business Journal. You can find that at rcbizjournal.com. Welcome, Tina. How you doing?
I am doing great. How is everybody? Such a beautiful day.
I will speak for everybody and say we're just dandy.
Dandy is good.
Yes, it is.
It is. Let's see what's happening in the world of business.
Yes.
Well, I think we put out two stories last week, and they have their differences. But what ties them together are these are both about developments that are being opposed. One's in Nyack and one is in Piermont. Let me just lay the groundwork for what we're talking about in case anybody has read these stories or is not familiar. In the case of Piermont, which, as everybody knows, is one of Rockland's gems, a quaint Victorian village, there is a proposal to build a 3-story, 14-unit residential rental building. And this is proposed right smack in the middle of the village, actually right across from the village hall. I know you know Piermont, Jeff,
Mm-hmm.
and this is that space. It's been an empty. It's basically been an inadvertent parking lot. It's been an empty space for decades, and it's been used as parking. And now a couple of developers want to put what is a very modern, boxy, kind of think White Plains structure right smack in the middle of the village. Now, when we covered the meeting, the standing room only people trickling out the back door because there was no room in the room meeting last week, what happened was when there was the reveal of a rendering, an audible gasp actually reverberated through the room. People were viscerally, what can I say, outraged to think that this sort of modern building would be slapped down into a village that from end to end at least, it's a small village, but from end to end pretty much retains certain character. So this was a marathon meeting, and the developers and the architect presented the plans and went through the minutia of it. And people, of course, got up and spoke in opposition. And so one issue and in fact, one thing that's interesting that came up at that meeting is in many towns and municipalities, villages even, there is an architectural review board, right? So there is some place where a developer goes and says, does this meet muster? What do we need to do? In the case of Piermont, they don't have such a board. So the planning board is going to be saddled with that, as well as other issues that came up, including traffic, all the usual things, traffic, flooding, view sheds, and even the fact that there was apparently a gas station on that site many years ago. So, what might be lying beneath. The interesting thing I think that gets raised when developments like this come before planning boards is, well, if a developer has, let's say they do have an as of right, and for anybody who is not wonky enough to know what that means, it means that there's nothing really standing in the developer's way in terms of needing a variance, or it's the height is wrong, or the amount of density is wrong. If they have a clear path, I think the question that projects like this raise is, how much does the aesthetic design play into the decision of public officials when developers come before the board? There was a similar situation, similar story that we wrote several weeks ago about a project in Nyack, also actually funny enough, to replace the gas station down on South Broadway in Nyack. And there, too, there were some of the similar issues in terms of the parking, the height, look of the building. It was the same sort of feeling that these kinds of developments that you see all over White Plains and in New Jersey and everywhere now. There's a certain look to them. There's sort of brick on the bottom and they have a hardy plank on the top, and they're very boxy and modern. Do they belong in these villages? That's kind of the question. The other thing that arose and is still, I think, unresolved in Piermont is so wind back and a couple of years ago, and Piermont changed its zoning code. There's an issue around this particular application because the village believed that it accurately adopted a new zoning code, and when a project has to, sail through all the different agencies around the county, like sewer or the sheriff or environmental agencies, one of the stops that an application generally has to make is at the county planning department, and it's called the General Municipal Review. GML is the shorthand for it. There's some conflict here as to whether the GML the planning department ever really had a chance to look at this zoning code, and so this application also might be in a little bit of a limbo because there's some vagary around whether or not the village properly adopted its zoning law in the first place. So that's kind of a sub-issue which, may just be a matter of we swap some paperwork to sort things out. But it was as I said, a marathon night, a long-spirited night. Some other interesting issues I think came up with regard to the context of people coming to planning boards, and that is one resident raised the issue of he said to the board, have you done due diligence? Do you know who this developer is? Are they will they finish this project if it's approved? Do they have the chops? Do they have the money? Is what he was basically saying. So, I find these things are interesting because they play out in every single community at various times in terms of when a community says it doesn't want a project and how much pressure that puts on a planning board or a zoning board and what factors need to be weighed in. And so that went on in Piermont simultaneously, but we also reported in Nyack. So, unless you have any questions so far?
No, no questions, but I was wondering what you thought about it in particular. I mean, do you think, because I'm sitting here listening to you and I'm thinking, at what point is it okay to change the aesthetics of how a building looks in an area? I mean, we don't build houses the way they looked 3,000 years ago. I mean, at some point they change.
Yes, I agree with that. This is what I would say to that, because I live in a 170-year-old house, and I'm sensitive to that. I think somebody made the point that villages like Piermont, like Nyack, are blessed to have more layers of history than some of the other places around the county. They have concentrations of older buildings, and those older buildings make up the character of the place, and that character factors into who wants to, the desirability of living in such a place. Tourism is a factor, aesthetics. I think it does matter. I think that there's a layering of history, and that you have to kind of move. I think it's okay to build something modern as long as it borrows from and has notes of history, so that in some way it looks like a progression rather than something that looks like it's just out of character, right? So in fact, I think it was the planning board chairman himself who was saying, that if you look at certain developments like brownstones, there are certain architectural elements that can be used even in a modern building, but that would draw on the aesthetics of the existing streetscape and landscape. And I thought that was a fair point, and one that I would agree. Personally, if you're asking, I agree with that. I think it doesn't make sense to just kind of plop down something because it's easier for the developer or efficient for the architect. I think that you do have to take into consideration where you are, what the context, right? What's the context of where you're siting a building? It belongs wouldn't you agree with that? That if it belongs somewhere, so what's around it?
No, I'm not sure I do, and I say that I live in a development for the last 25 years where all the houses look similar to each other. They were all built around the same time, and they were all a part of a similar the same developer built them all similarly. But that being said, if one of my neighbors wanted to wreck their house and build something that was maybe an adobe or something else just different, I'm not sure I would mind that. I mean, even though it has nothing to do with the character, so-called, of the neighborhood, I don't know. As long as it's not, got missiles and spikes sticking out of it and shooting laser beams in my eyes, I guess I'm fine with it.
I guess the difference here is that maybe the difference is that you're talking about a subdivision, presumably, or residential development,
right?
And this is a commercial district. So,
where there is also housing, there are also homes.
Yes, that's right. But
right now, it's just an empty lot of nothing. It's just,
right. No, I mean, when people say, that they should preserve that space, that's ridiculous because you're right. That's an empty dirt lot that's been filled with cars. If anything, that's 10 times worse. It's just an eyesore. Agreed. It is an eyesore, and there's no reason to argue that that's worth preserving. But what gets put in there, I think it should have some contextual relationship to what's around it. Like when sometimes if you ever walk around in a village, I mean, or places like, I'm thinking Rhinebeck, I'm thinking Beacon, I'm thinking Nyack, and you're walking around and you're charmed, to the gills, and it's like, oh, this is so beautiful. But then you see a building usually from the 70s, and you go, how did that get there? I think that's the thing is a village. I think a commercial village does deserve to have cohesion as long as a building can be modern, but it should still borrow, I think, in some way so that it fits in. I think that's reasonable.
I don't know. I'm not saying it's unreasonable, but in your scenario, if I'm walking around a village like Rhinebeck or Nyack and I see something that looks different, I don't say, "Hey, how did that get there?" I go, "Hey, that looks interesting. That's different. Cool." Or, I don't know. I don't feel like it has to conform with the standards that everyone else sets. I'm more of a, hey, if something stands out, all the better.
All right, I hear you. Well, we'll watch this application because it's interesting. It has to go for a special permit before the village board. Right now, it's before the planning board, and I suspect it's going to be a long slog.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Hey, Tina, thanks for you're joining us as always. We're out of time, unfortunately. We'll look forward to talking to you again next Monday.
All right. Have a great week.
Thank you. And for our emails and newsletters and all the latest business news, just go to rcbizjournal.com. Tina Traster, their editor. Thank you so much for joining us, as always.